terrified all 200 employees of his business empire, rules over a workplace where no one dares to approach him. When a new cleaner is allowed to bring her 5-year-old daughter to the office, everyone fears the worst. One morning, after receiving devastating news that makes him break down in tears for the first time in decades, the innocent girl finds him crying and whispers the words no one would ever dare to say. "Sir, may I give you a hug?" As her mother watches in terror, afraid of being fired, what he does next shocks every employee and reveals a transformation that will change not only his life, but the reality of everyone around him. The Tuesday morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows of Arthur Pierce's office, painting the New York City skyline in hues of gold and promise. From the height of his empire on the top floor of one of Manhattan's most imposing skyscrapers, the world looked small, a chessboard where he moved the pieces with masterful skill. The aroma of freshly ground Arabica coffee hung in the air, an expensive fragrance that usually calmed him, but today only served to sharpen the electricity coursing through his veins. Every second dragged with the weight of an eternity. He was waiting for a call, the call that would change everything. His company, a colossus built on sweat and an unshakable faith in his own talent, was teetering on the edge of a financial precipice he refused to admit to publicly. That phone call from an international investor, a man named Petrov, who had appeared like a guardian angel, was the only bridge across the chasm. Millions of dollars were at stake, the salvation of hundreds of jobs, and more importantly, to his wounded ego, the preservation of his legacy. A soft knock on the solid oak door pulled him from his reverie. It was Elena, his cleaning lady, a woman with a tired but dignified gaze who kept his sanctuary immaculate. Beside her, shyly clutching the hem of her uniform, was a little girl with large, watchful eyes, young Lara. Eleanor stepped forward, her face etched with worry. "Mr. Pierce, I am so sorry. Lara's school had a last-minute burst pipe, and I had no one to leave her with. She'll be quiet in a corner, I promise. She won't be any trouble." Arthur, who normally loathed any break in his meticulously controlled routine, felt a pang of irritation but masked it with a forced smile. "It's fine, Elena. As long as she's silent." He barely glanced at the child, his thoughts already returning to the anxious melody of the phone that refused to ring. Lara didn't need to be told to be quiet. Silence was her shield in a loud, unpredictable world. As her mother began her work, she settled into a small armchair in the corner of the office, a tiny dot amidst the vastness of leather, glass, and steel. Her eyes, however, weren't on the expensive toys or the art books on the coffee table. They were fixed on Arthur. She watched him pace, his jaw tight, his gaze lost in the urban landscape. She had seen him like this the day before, but his anxiety was different. Yesterday, while her mother was cleaning the adjacent conference room, she had overheard him on the phone with a man who had a slick, grating voice. The name Petrov was mentioned, along with numbers she didn't understand. But it was the man's tone that had made her shrink back. It was the same tone the dangerous men in her neighborhood used before something bad happened, a mixture of false friendship and veiled threat. Suddenly, Arthur's personal cell phone rang, shattering the tension. It was a call from his COO. "Emergency meeting, Arthur. Now, one of our biggest clients is threatening to pull their contract." The urgency in the voice on the other end was undeniable. Arthur swore under his breath. "I'm on my way," he said, hanging up. He grabbed his briefcase, his face a mask of frustration. He looked at Elena. "I have to step out. If a Mr. Petrov calls from overseas, please take a message. Tell him I'll call back as soon as I can. It's the most important call of my life." With that, he hurried out, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The silence returned to fill the office, heavier now. A few minutes later, the phone on Arthur's desk began to ring, its shrill sound cutting through the air. Elena was in the other room, the noise of the vacuum cleaner drowning out the call. But Lara heard it. She looked at the flashing device, the name Petrov glowing on the caller ID. The memory of yesterday's slick voice echoed in her mind. She saw the anxiety on her boss's face, his blind faith in that name. With a determination that belied her age, she slipped off the armchair, walked to the imposing desk, climbed onto the leather chair, and picked up the receiver. Outside the door, Arthur stopped. He had forgotten his wallet. He turned the handle silently, pushing the door open, just a crack. That's when he heard a small, cold voice say the words that froze the blood in his veins. "Never call my boss again." A sharp click followed, the sound of the phone being hung up. Arthur stood paralyzed, confusion and shock seizing his mind. What the hell was happening? For a long moment, Arthur remained motionless in the crack of the doorway, the click of the phone echoing in his mind like a gunshot in the silence. Reality seemed to have folded in on itself, creating a scenario so absurd his brain refused to process it. A child, his cleaning lady's daughter, sitting in his chairman's seat, had just hung up on the man who held his company's future in his hands. The initial confusion quickly gave way to a wave of icy fury. Every beat of his heart hammered out a single word: disaster. He shoved the door open with force, the sound of the wood hitting the frame making Eleanor, who was returning from the kitchenette with a cloth in hand, jump in fright. Her eyes widened at the scene. Arthur, standing like a thundercloud, and her daughter, Lara, still perched in the leather chair that seemed to swallow her whole, her small hand resting on the silent phone. "Elena." Arthur's voice was dangerously low, devoid of any warmth. "Can you explain to me what is happening here?" His eyes never left the little girl, who now stared back at him with a disconcerting seriousness, without a trace of childish fear. Elena dropped the cloth, her face pale with dread. "Mr. Pierce, I don't know. I swear she didn't mean any harm." "Lara, what did you do?" "Apologize to your boss right now." She rushed toward her daughter, her hands trembling, ready to pull her from the chair, to kneel and beg if she had to. Losing this job would be the ruin of her small family. But Lara didn't move. She just looked at Arthur, her dark, deep eyes conveying an unshakable conviction. "He was a bad man, Mommy," she said, her voice firm. Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh, a sound that contained no humor. "A bad man? You just cost this company millions of dollars because of a childish fantasy." He strode to the desk, his imposing presence filling the space. He leaned in, resting his knuckles on the polished wood, his face inches from Lara's. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? That was the most important call of my life." The desperation he had been hiding for weeks began to leak through his controlled facade. The humiliation of being on the brink of bankruptcy, the crushing pressure, it all focused on this small figure who had dared to interfere with his destiny. "Elena, get your things, and your daughters. You're both dismissed." The words fell like death sentences in the silent office. Tears finally welled in Elena's eyes, streaming down her tired face. "Please, sir, it was an accident. She's just a child. I need this job." She grabbed Arthur's arm, a gesture of desperate supplication. He pulled away, repulsed by the touch. His decision was final. Discipline and order were the pillars of his success. There could be no room for this kind of chaos. He was already calculating the damage, figuring out how he could fix this, how he could call Petrov back and apologize, invent a plausible excuse for the call being dropped by a child. It was then that Lara's voice cut through his frantic thoughts. He said the name "scrap iron." The sentence was delivered quietly, almost a whisper, but it had the effect of a shout. Arthur froze, the dismissal process in his mind grinding to a halt. He turned slowly toward her. "What did you say?" Elena looked at her daughter, confused. "Lara, what name is that? Stop making things up." But the girl wasn't making things up. Her eyes were locked on Arthur's, a strange bridge of communication forming between the millionaire and the child from the outer boroughs. "Yesterday," she continued, her voice gaining strength, When he was talking to you from the other room, he said the plan was just like what they did to Scrap Iron, the same man who tricked the owner of the deli on our street. Arthur remained silent, the fury in his chest being replaced by a cold, creeping sense of unease. The name Scrap Iron meant nothing to him, but the specificity of the warning, the conviction in those childish eyes, was undeniable. How could she know something like that? The mention of an unknown name. The Scrap Iron, coming from the mouth of an 8-year-old girl, should have been absurd, easily dismissed. Yet something in the way Lara spoke, in the clarity of her memory, planted a seed of doubt in Arthur's mind. It was a tiny, almost insignificant seed buried under layers of corporate arrogance and certainty, but it was there. He looked at the girl, who still stared at him with an unusual gravity, and then at Elena, whose face was stained with tears and confusion. Logic told him to ignore it, to proceed with the firing and try to salvage his multi-million-dollar deal. But his gut, the instinct for business that had taken him to the top, was screaming silently that something was wrong. "Explain," he said finally, his voice still hard, but lacking the finality of dismissal from before. He took a step back from the desk, crossing his arms, adopting the posture of a judge willing to hear one last appeal. Elena looked at her daughter with a mixture of fear and hope. "Lara, tell the truth. What did you hear?" Lara was not intimidated by their stares. She slid off the chair, her little feet barely touching the floor, and moved closer to her mother, seeking a moment's comfort before turning back to Arthur. "Yesterday, Mom was cleaning the boardroom. The door was a little open. You were on the phone with that man, Petrov. His voice was ugly, like honey mixed with broken glass. He laughed in a strange way when you weren't laughing. The description was childlike, yet strangely precise." Arthur remembered Petrov's laughter, a guttural sound he had interpreted as camaraderie, not mockery. "Go on," Arthur commanded, curiosity beginning to overcome his anger. Lara nodded, her memory working with photographic clarity. "He said you were the big fish they'd been waiting for, and that the bait had worked perfectly. Then he spoke softly, like it was a secret, and told another man who was with him, 'It's going to be just like the Scrap Iron job, but 100 times bigger.' And they both laughed. Every word was a small stone thrown against the glass window of his confidence. "Who is Scrap Iron?" he asked, his voice now a thread. Elena wiped her tears, confusion giving way to comprehension. "Scrap Iron is what everyone calls Joe, the owner of the junkyard in our neighborhood," she explained. "A good, hard-working man. A few months ago, he lost everything. Some well-dressed men showed up, promised him an investment that would double his business. They made him sign a stack of papers, take out a huge loan, and transfer it all to an account. The next day, they were gone, and the debt was his. Joe lost the junkyard, his house, everything." The story, told with the simplicity of real life, was a cliché financial scam, the kind of thing Arthur read about in the papers and thought, "What a fool." It would never happen to him. He was too smart, too experienced. And yet, the coincidence was disturbing. A name, a method. His mind began to race, connecting dots he had previously ignored. Petrov's rush to close the deal, the lack of a deeper due diligence from his team, lapses he had attributed to the urgency of the situation. The investor's insistence on using a specific account for the initial transfer, a standard procedure for international transactions, he had said. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. The structure of the deal, stripped of its corporate jargon, was frighteningly similar to Scrap Iron Joe's simple story. He looked at the girl. She couldn't have invented this. The details were too specific, the connection too unlikely to be a product of a child's imagination. The realization hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. This child, with her wisdom forged on the rough streets of a neighborhood he only saw through the window of his town car, had identified a pattern that he, in his bubble of privilege and self-confidence, had been unable to see. The call he had been waiting for wasn't his salvation, it was the trap closing. The girl hadn't destroyed his future, she had saved it at the last possible second. The humiliation he felt was staggering, followed closely by a deep, genuine fear. He had almost handed his empire, his life's work, to a predator. And the alarm had been sounded not by his lawyers or financial consultants, but by an 8-year-old girl. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text from his bank manager. "Arthur, the destination account for the initial wire has been confirmed. We can proceed tomorrow at 9 a.m. per your instructions." The bank manager's message glowed on the screen, each word a nail being hammered into the coffin of his arrogance. "We can proceed tomorrow at 9 a.m. The proximity of the disaster was palpable, a chasm he had nearly walked across with his eyes closed. By mere hours, perhaps minutes, he had been one step away from authorizing the transfer that would have led to his ruin. The air in the office seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. The fury he'd felt moments before had completely dissipated, replaced by a cold void in the pit of his stomach. He looked at Lara, no longer as the cleaning lady's daughter, but as the bearer of an inconvenient and terrifying truth. The girl continued to watch him, her eyes showing no triumph, only a silent observation, as if she were waiting for him to finally understand the lesson the universe was trying to teach him. "Elena," Arthur said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. He sank heavily into one of the leather armchairs, the gesture of a man who had been physically struck. "Tell me more about this Joe, about what happened to him." Elena, sensing the dramatic shift in her boss, approached cautiously. She pulled her daughter close, her arm wrapping around the girl's small shoulders like a protective shield. "There's not much more to tell, Mr. Pierce. It was fast. They were charming, spoke beautifully, promised the world. They made Joe feel important, like he was the chosen one. He, who'd always been a simple man, believed his luck had turned. He signed the papers without reading them properly, trusting their word, and when the money vanished, so did they. The police were called, but they said it was a civil matter, that he'd signed the documents of his own free will. No one was arrested. Joe was left with the shame and the debt. Every detail of Elena's story was a distorted echo of his own negotiation with Petrov. The charm, the rush, the feeling of being the chosen one for a unique opportunity. The complex paperwork that his lawyers had reviewed, but perhaps not with the necessary skepticism, hurried by the promise of a capital infusion. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He, the titan of business, the man who prided himself on smelling a bad deal from a mile away, was about to fall for the same scam that had victimized a humble junkyard owner. The only difference was the scale. Where Joe had lost tens of thousands, he stood to lose millions. The scam was the same. Only the size of the bait had changed. The humiliation was like acid corroding his pride. Being saved by a child was one thing. Realizing he was making the exact same mistake as a man he would have considered naive was another, far more profound. His phone rang again. This time, the name Petrov flashed on the screen. The shrill sound seemed to mock him. Instinctively, he glanced at Lara. The girl gave a subtle nod, as if giving him permission to face the truth. With a trembling finger, he answered, putting it on speakerphone so Elena and Lara could hear. "Arthur, my friend, I was getting worried." The call dropped. "Any trouble?" Petrov's voice was exactly as Lara had described. Honey mixed with broken glass, falsely warm, dangerously smooth. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "We had a small technical issue. Petrov, nothing serious. He needed time to think, to understand the extent of the trap. About tomorrow's transfer. Ah, yes, everything is ready on our end. My bankers are just awaiting your confirmation. As soon as your initial guarantee funds are in our account, we will release the full investment, standard procedure, as you know." The jargon was perfect, reassuring. But now, to Arthur, Every word sounded like the click of a locking mechanism. He knew what he had to do. He had to buy time, he had to investigate, and he had to protect the girl who had just put a target on her own back. A terrible thought struck him. If Petrov was who Lara said he wasn't just a con man, he was a predator. And predators don't like it when their prey escapes, especially when they're exposed by an unexpected witness. The call was no longer about money, it was about survival. "I need another 24 hours, Petrov," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly calm, a facade of control he didn't feel. "My board is demanding a final, last-minute review. Bureaucracy. You know how it is." He hated lying, considered it a weakness, but right now it was his only weapon. A heavy silence settled on the other end of the line. For a moment, Arthur thought the connection had dropped again. But then Petrov's voice returned, the honey in his tone a little thinner, revealing the glass underneath. 24 hours. "Arthur, I thought we had an agreement. This opportunity is time-sensitive. My other partners are impatient." The word partners hung in the air, laden with a subtle threat. It was no longer a negotiation between two men, it was a warning. "It's non-negotiable, Petrov. End of business tomorrow. You'll have your answer," Arthur insisted, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. He disconnected before the other man could protest, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bluff had worked, for now. He turned to Elena and Lara. The color had returned to Elena's face, but the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a new, deeper anxiety. She understood now that this wasn't just about her job. Her daughter had meddled in the affairs of dangerous people. "Elena, listen to me carefully," Arthur said, the command returning to his voice, but now aimed at protection, not reprimand. "From this moment on, you two are not leaving my side. You and Lara will stay here in the building. I have a fully equipped guest suite. No one will know you're here. It's the safest place for now." Elena opened her mouth to protest, to say she didn't want to be a bother, that they could take care of themselves. But the look on Arthur's face silenced her. It wasn't a request, it was a necessity. Their world had become dangerous in a matter of minutes, and this office, once a simple workplace, was now their only refuge. While a stunned Elena took Lara to see the luxurious apartment a few floors below, Arthur began to act. The first call was to his head of security, an ex-cop named Marcus, a man whose loyalty and discretion were absolute. Within minutes, Marcus was in his office, his impassive expression unchanged as Arthur recounted the bizarre story, omitting the source of his information for the moment. "I want you to dig into this Petrov. Full name, history, partners, everything. Use every resource you have, and I want you to find everything you can about a scam run on a man named Joe, a junkyard owner in..." He paused, glancing at the door. "I'll get you the address." Next, he called his lawyer and his bank manager, canceling the transfer and instructing them to freeze any transactions related to the deal until further notice. Each call was a step back from the precipice. Night fell over the city, but the lights in Arthur's office stayed on. He and Marcus worked in silence, the occasional sound of keystrokes and phone calls breaking the tension. The first pieces of information began to trickle in, and they were alarming. The name Petrov was a ghost. There were no official records, no online presence, nothing. The company he represented was a shell corporation, an empty vessel registered in a tax haven. It was a professional setup designed to be untraceable. Arthur's frustration mounted. He had the instinct, the warning, but no hard proof. How could he fight a shadow? In the middle of the night, exhausted, he went to check on Elena and Lara. He found them in the suite's kitchen. Lara was drawing in a sketchbook she'd found, while Elena made tea, her face still tense. "I'm sorry for all of this, sir," she whispered. "No, Elena, I'm the one who's sorry," he replied, and the sincerity in his voice surprised her. "Your daughter, she saved me." He glanced at Lara's drawing. It was stick figures, a small girl, a woman, and a tall man, holding hands in front of a big building. And in the distance, a dark, shadowy figure was watching them. The drawing was childish, but the message was clear. The danger hadn't gone away. It was just watching, waiting. Just then, Elena's cell phone rang. An unknown number. She answered, hesitant. A low, distorted male voice spoke on the other end. "Elena, we know where you work, and we know about your daughter. Curious children sometimes get hurt. It would be a shame if something happened to her on the way to school, wouldn't it? Stay quiet, pretend nothing happened, and everything will be fine." The call ended. Elena dropped the phone, her face a mask of pure terror. The threat was no longer subtle or corporate. It was personal, direct, and brutal. They knew who they were, and they knew exactly how to hurt them. The dull thud of Elena's cell phone hitting the marble floor echoed in the apartment's silence, a fragile sound that marked the beginning of a new kind of fear. The terror that washed over her face was primal, the anguish of a mother who had just heard her worst nightmare verbalized. The anonymous caller's words hung in the air, venomous and sticky. Curious children sometimes get hurt. Arthur reacted on instinct, scooping the phone off the floor and glancing at the screen. But the number was already gone, replaced by the word private. The threat was designed to be a ghost, untraceable, but its impact terrifyingly real. Lara, who had been absorbed in her drawing, looked up, her large, dark eyes fixed on her mother's pale face, and she understood, with the sharp intuition of someone who has always lived on alert, that the monster she had drawn had just snarled through the phone. "They are not going to touch you," Arthur said, his voice more of a vow than a reassurance. The anger he felt was cold and sharp. It was one thing for them to try and con him, to steal his money, to attack his business. That was the game, however dirty. But to threaten a child, to use a mother's love as a weapon that crossed a fundamental line, it turned a business problem into a personal war. He led Elena, who was trembling uncontrollably, to a sofa. Lara, without a word, climbed up beside her mother and hugged her, a small body offering immense comfort. The girl's silent act of courage only solidified Arthur's resolve. He was no longer just defending himself. He was protecting them. He called Marcus, his head of security, back to the apartment and relayed the threat word for word. Marcus's normally impassive face tightened into a hard line. "They're testing you. They want to see if the threat is enough to buy your silence," Marcus said. "That means two things. First, they're close, watching. Second, the girl really did hear something that seriously incriminates them." Arthur looked at Lara, who was now stroking her mother's hair. A child who had become the key witness in a criminal conspiracy. The irony was cruel. "We need to get them out of the city," Marcus suggested. "A safe place, far from here, until the dust settles." Arthur considered it for a moment. It was the logical, safest choice. But something stopped him. Sending Elena and Lara away would be admitting defeat, surrendering to intimidation. And more importantly, it would leave Lara, the only one who could identify Petrov's voice and who knew the link to the scrap iron con, out of reach. "No," he decided, surprising both himself and Marcus. "They expect us to run. They expect us to hide. That's what scared people do. But we're not going to hide. We're going to stay here where I can protect them. And we're going to fight." It was a risky decision, driven as much by strategic logic as by a newfound sense of responsibility for the two souls fate had placed under his roof. The first week dragged on in a state of self-imposed siege. The guest suite became a gilded fortress. Marcus ramped up security in the building, monitoring all entries and exits. Elena and Lara never went out. Arthur arranged for clothes, food, books, and toys, trying to create a semblance of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. By day, He and Marcus continued to dig, searching for any lead on Petrov and his network. Every dead end heightened the frustration. The scrap iron Jocon seemed to be their only tangible link, but the poor man was too terrified to talk, fearing reprisals against his own family. The criminal network was like a spider's web, invisible until it was too late. Late in the week, the second small breakthrough came. Marcus, using a shadowy contact in the banking system, managed to trace the account where Arthur's money was supposed to go. It didn't lead to Petrov, but to a series of shell companies that, in turn, led to something even more shocking. The account was linked to a prominent lawyer in the city, a man Arthur knew socially, someone he would never have suspected, the man who, coincidentally, had recommended Petrov to him at a charity event months ago. The realization hit Arthur like ice water. The enemy wasn't just outside. He had an accomplice on the inside, someone who knew his vulnerabilities, his precarious financial situation, and his desperation. He hadn't been chosen at random. He had been hunted, and the hunt had started long before he'd ever known. The revelation that his own lawyer, Mr. Davies, was the traitor, the architect of his ruin, was a deeper blow than any financial loss. Arthur felt as if the ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand. Trust, for him, was a currency as valuable as money, and his had been counterfeited in the vilest way. He spent the night awake, replaying every conversation, every handshake, every smile shared with Davies over the past months, now seeing it all in a new, sinister light. The man hadn't just referred him to a con artist, he had delivered him, served him up on a silver platter, knowing exactly where and how to press to break his resolve. His company's financial desperation wasn't a secret, but Davies knew the intimate details, the true extent of the problem. He had used that privileged information to weave the perfect web. The atmosphere in the guest suite shifted. The initial tension, fueled by the adrenaline of discovery and flight, gave way to a heavy silence, the kind that accompanies a long wait. Elena tried to maintain a routine, cleaning an apartment that was already immaculate, preparing meals that were barely touched. Lara, meanwhile, seemed to be the small group's anchor of sanity. She didn't question, didn't complain about the confinement. She spent hours drawing or reading the books Arthur had provided, her calm presence a stark counterpoint to the whirlwind of emotions in the adults around her. Sometimes, Arthur would watch her and wonder how a child could carry so much weight with such grace. He realized now that her resilience wasn't childish. It was the armor of a survivor. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon that the course of the story changed irrevocably. Arthur was in his office, reviewing Marcus's reports on Davies, a life of unexplained luxury, frequent trips to the same tax havens as Petrov's company, when his intercom buzzed. It was his receptionist, her voice trembling with panic. "Mr. Pierce, there are people here. They say they're from financial crimes. They have a warrant. They're turning the place upside down." Arthur felt his blood run cold. He raced to the small adjacent security room where Marcus was already monitoring the cameras. The scene on his executive floor was one of controlled chaos. Men and women in dark suits, moving with a cold efficiency, were seizing files, computers, documents. An invasion. How? "No one knew we were investigating," Arthur muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. The answer came minutes later, via one of Marcus's contacts in the force. "It's not an investigation into Petrov or Davies, Arthur," Marcus said, his face grim. "It's an investigation into you." There was an anonymous tip, a detailed tip with account numbers and transaction dates, alleging that your company is involved in a money laundering and tax evasion scheme. Arthur stared at the screen, stunned. The cruel genius of the plan revealed itself in its full scope. They weren't running, they weren't hiding, they had counterattacked. They had used the very structure of their con, the offshore accounts, the complex transfers, to frame him as the mastermind. His refusal to make the final transfer would be presented as an attempt to double-cross his own accomplices. He was no longer the victim. In the eyes of the law, he was the villain. An alarm blared on the security panel, a sharp beep indicating movement in the private residential floor corridor. On the monitors, Arthur saw two of the investigators, flanked by building security, walking purposefully toward the guest suite. They knew, somehow, he wasn't in his office, that he was here. The refuge had become a trap. He looked at Marcus, desperation etched on his face. He was cornered. Inside that apartment were Elena and Lara, the witnesses who could prove his innocence, but whose very presence here, hidden away, would only incriminate him further, making him look guilty of coercing or hiding witnesses. Loud, authoritative knocks sounded at the door. "Open up! Financial crimes!" The voice on the other side was firm, official. Arthur stared at the door that separated him from the destruction of his reputation and, possibly, his freedom. He was trapped with the two people he was trying to protect, and their presence was now the most damning evidence against him. The sound of knocking on the door was like a judge's gavel coming down. Each blow resonated in Arthur's chest, an echo of his own frantic heartbeat. Elena let out a low whimper, a sound of pure fear, and instinctively pulled Lara behind her, as if her own thin body could serve as a barrier against the world. Panic threatened to paralyze Arthur, but Marcus's gaze, focused and cold as steel, brought him back to reality. "They don't have a warrant for this specific suite, just for the company's commercial areas," Marcus whispered, his voice a hum of urgency. "But if we don't open up, they'll get one in under an hour and break it down, and refusing to cooperate will be the first nail in your coffin." The logic was flawless and terrifying. They were in a trap with no visible exit. Arthur looked at Lara. The girl wasn't crying. Her large, serious eyes moved from the door to his face, then to her mother's. There was an understanding there, an acceptance of the danger that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. It was the sight of that small figure facing the collapse of their world with silent courage that ignited a spark of defiance in Arthur. He would not be caught here, not like this. "There has to be another way out," he said to Marcus, his voice a harsh whisper. Marcus nodded. "Already moving toward the suite service area. The laundry chute is too small, but there's an access door for elevator maintenance at the end of the service hall. It's a gamble. If there are workers in there, we're caught." There was no time to weigh the options. The knocking became more insistent, now accompanied by the firm voice identifying itself again. Elena looked from Marcus to Arthur, the terror in her eyes battling with the need to trust. "Come on," Arthur said, holding a hand out to her. He took Lara's small hand in his other. The contact was warm and real, an anchor in the chaos. He led the way, and Elena followed, moving like an automaton through the luxury that now seemed a mockery. Marcus quietly opened the service door, revealing a narrow, poorly lit corridor that smelled of dust and oil. It was the building's skeleton, a world Arthur never knew existed. The contrast with his marble and carpeted hallways was stark. Here, in the gloom, their salvation or their capture would be decided. They moved in single file, the sounds from the main corridor muffled but still audible. Every creak of the floor beneath their feet sounded like thunder. Arthur kept Lara close, feeling the implicit trust in her small hand that held his tightly. Never in his life had he felt so responsible for other people. This wasn't the distant responsibility of a CEO for his employees, but the visceral responsibility of a guardian. In that dark hallway, he was not a millionaire. He was just a man trying to protect a family. Marcus stopped before an unmarked metal door. He pressed his ear against it, listening for a long moment before turning the handle with agonizing slowness. The door opened with a low groan, revealing not the elevator shaft, but a spiral service staircase, plunged into darkness. It was an escape route. They descended several flights in absolute silence, emerging onto an empty office floor still under renovation. They were safe, for now. The distant sound of sirens outside was a reminder that the world hadn't paused for their drama. Exhausted, they sank onto the dusty floor of an unfinished office. Just then, Marcus's phone vibrated. He answered, listened for a moment, and his face hardened. He looked at Arthur, and the news came like a final punch. That was my contact on the board. With the investigation underway, they called an emergency meeting. You've been suspended from your duties as CEO, effective immediately. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned to Eleanor, the compassion in his eyes making the next words even crueler. And, Elena, for breach of corporate security protocols, they've terminated your employment contract. Marcus's words fell into the dusty silence of the unfinished office with the finality of tombstones. Suspended, terminated. For Arthur, the loss of the CEO title was a phantom blow. His empire already felt distant, a life that had belonged to someone else. But for Elena, the news was a blade that cut her off at the knees. A guttural sound, a sob of absolute despair, escaped her lips, and she collapsed, her hands covering her face as if to hide from the world that was crumbling around her. That job wasn't just a paycheck, it was dignity, a precarious security, the promise of a better future for Lara, the single fragile barrier that separated them from the violence and uncertainty of the neighborhood they had left behind. Now, that barrier had been pulverized by a cruel, faceless bureaucracy, a weapon wielded by enemies they didn't even know. Arthur knelt beside her, the expensive fabric of his pants gathering construction dust, a trivial detail that underscored the fall from his pedestal. He offered no empty words of comfort. Instead, a cold, crystalline anger formed in his chest. He understood the tactic with nauseating clarity. It wasn't standard procedure. It was a surgical strike. By firing Elena, they weren't just cutting off her income. They were evicting her from the only safe place she had left. They were forcing her back to her neighborhood, to their territory, where she and Lara would be easy targets, vulnerable to the intimidation and fear that flourished on those streets. They were isolating her, pulling her out from under his protective shield. The injustice of it, the cowardice of using an innocent woman and her child as pawns in their dirty game, solidified something inside Arthur. The battle for his business was lost, for now, but the war for this family's safety was just beginning. "We can't stay here," Marcus said, his voice low and practical, cutting through the moment's pain. "They'll be searching the whole building, and your assets, Arthur, accounts, cards. Expect them to be frozen soon as part of the process. We're running out of time and resources." The reality was brutal. The millionaire was, for all intents and purposes, becoming a penniless fugitive. "We'll go home," Elena said, her voice muffled by her hands but filled with a resolve born of desperation. "It's the only place we have." "Absolutely not," Arthur answered instantly. "That's exactly where they want you to go. It's a trap." "And what other choice do we have?" she retorted, lifting her tear-stained face, her eyes flashing with a mix of panic and wounded pride. "I can't accept anything more from you. You've already cost us everything." The accusation, though born of pain, hit Arthur like a fist. He was the cause of all of this. His naivete, his arrogance, had dragged them into his nightmare. He looked at Lara, who was watching the exchange with a heartbreaking stillness. She took no sides, just watched, her eyes seeming to say that she had expected this, that the world was a place where safety was always temporary. In that instant, Arthur made a decision that would redefine the rest of his life. He was no longer the boss, the distant benefactor. He was a part of this. He was responsible. "Then I'm going with you," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. Eleanor and Marcus stared at him, stunned. "Arthur, that's insane," Marcus said. "You'll be a sitting duck there." I'm already a sitting duck everywhere, Arthur shot back. At least there I can be with them. I'm not leaving them alone, not after what I've done. Using the service network and Marcus's ingenuity, they managed to slip out of the building undetected, trading the luxury prison for an inconspicuous sedan Marcus had arranged. The drive was a silent blur, the scenery gradually shifting from glass skyscrapers to low, graffiti-tagged buildings, from wide, tree-lined avenues to narrow, poorly lit streets. The air seemed to get heavier, freighted with the untold stories of struggle and survival. They pulled up in front of a small, simple house, squeezed between two others. It was neat and cared for, with a flower pot in the window, a small oasis of order in the urban chaos. But as they got out of the car, the quiet of the street felt menacing. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows. It was then that Lara, whose small hand had found Arthur's again, stopped dead. She squeezed his fingers hard, her body rigid. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pointed with her chin toward the end of the block. Parked under the weak glow of a streetlight was a dark sedan, identical to the one she had seen in the office parking garage the day she overheard Petrov's conversation. The windows were tinted, impenetrable, but they could feel the unseen eyes on them, a predatory presence that had followed them to their last refuge. The dark sedan at the end of the street was more than a car. It was a statement, a black ink stain on the pale watercolor of twilight, a predator waiting patiently at the edge of the herd. A cold dread, completely unlike the financial fear he knew, crawled up Arthur's spine. This was a primal fear, the fear of being hunted. For an instant, the world seemed to slow, the distant hum of traffic fading to a murmur. The only clear sound, the ragged breathing of Elena beside him. It was Marcus who broke the spell. "Inside, now!" he ordered in a low, firm whisper, moving to place himself between them and the car, an instinctive human shield. He gently nudged Arthur and Elena toward the door of the small house. Elena, her hands trembling, managed to find the key in her purse and open the lock. They slipped into the house and shut the door behind them, the click of the deadbolt sounding laughably inadequate against the threat they felt outside. The inside of Elena's house was the antithesis of Arthur's world. It was small but immaculately clean and organized. The smell of simmering beans and cleaning products hung in the air, an aroma of normalcy and home that contrasted violently with their situation. In the small living room, a bookshelf held more books than Arthur would have expected, and the walls were adorned with Lara's colorful drawings. It was a sanctuary built with love and little money, and now he had defiled it with the danger he had brought with him. Guilt hit him with renewed force. He, the man who lived in a penthouse that could swallow this entire house several times over, was now seeking refuge within its fragile walls. "Kill the lights," Marcus said, moving to the living room window and peering through a crack in the curtains. "They're still there, stationary, just watching." Elena complied, and the room plunged into shadow, lit only by the orange streetlights filtering through the blinds. Lara, who hadn't said a word, walked to the kitchen, climbed onto a small stool, and got a glass from the cupboard. She filled it with water from a filter pitcher and brought it to Arthur. "You must be thirsty," she said softly. The simple gesture, an act of hospitality in the midst of terror, broke something inside him. He took the glass, his large fingers dwarfing it. In that moment, he wasn't the boss, the millionaire, the man in charge. He was a frightened guest in the home of a little girl who somehow seemed stronger than he was. He sat on the modest sofa, a spring groaning under his weight. The chasm between his world and theirs had never seemed so vast and yet so meaningless. All his money, all his power was useless here. In fact, it was the cause of all the danger. The real wealth, he was beginning to realize, was the peace that had existed in this house before he arrived. "We need a plan," Marcus said, stepping back from the window. "We can't stay here. They know where we are. It's only a matter of time before they try something more direct. But before they could discuss any options, the sound of an engine slowly turning over broke the street's silence. Marcus rushed back to the window. They're moving, coming this way. The three adults held their breath. The car rolled slowly past the house, its dark windows like a shark's eyes. The slowness was deliberate, a show of power, a way of saying, "We are in control." The car continued on and turned the corner, disappearing from view. For a moment, they breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it was just intimidation. Maybe they were gone. Elena switched on a small table lamp, bringing a little warmth back to the room. It was then that Lara let out a small gasp. It wasn't a cry of fear, but of surprise and confusion. She was standing in the doorway of her bedroom, staring inside. "What is it, sweetie?" Elena asked, rushing to her side. Arthur and Marcus followed. Lara pointed to her bed. There, propped against the pillow, was her teddy bear, a well-loved old toy with one button eye missing. But something was wrong. Tied around its neck, a small red ribbon that hadn't been there before. A ribbon identical to the one Lara had worn in her hair that morning. The message was unmistakable and terrifying. The danger wasn't just outside, it had already been in the house. The sight of the red ribbon around the teddy bear's neck was like a punch of cold air to the lungs. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the small room, replaced by a suffocating sense of violation. It wasn't a verbal threat, it was something far worse. It was the silent, chilling proof that while they had been holed up in their luxury fortress, the monsters had already found the key to their most sacred refuge. They had entered this room, touched Lara's belongings, left their mark on the girl's most cherished object of affection. The implication was clear. No lock, no door, no distance could keep them safe. Marcus was the first to react, his training taking over. He entered the room, moving with cautious precision, his eyes scanning every corner for signs of entry. The window was locked from the inside. The front door had been too. There were no signs of a break-in. The realization only made it more terrifying. Whoever had gotten in had done so with a ghostly skill, leaving no trace, like smoke. Elena rushed forward and tore the ribbon from the bear, throwing it to the floor as if it were burning. She hugged Lara with a desperate strength, burying her face in her daughter's hair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The sanctuary had been defiled, and with it, the last flicker of hope that they could simply wait out the storm. Arthur felt a wave of impotent fury. He was cornered, stripped of his usual weapons, money, influence, power. Here, in this small room, faced with a mother's terror and a child's frightened stillness, he was just a man. And a man who had failed in his promise to protect them. The guilt was a physical weight, bowing his shoulders. It was Lara who, once again, showed an extraordinary resilience. She gently untangled herself from her mother's embrace and walked to where the red ribbon lay on the floor. She picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and then turned to Arthur. "They want us to be scared," she said, her voice small but firm. "That's how they win. By making people so afraid they give up." The wisdom in her words, forged in the hard reality of her life, was a sharp blade that cut through the panic. She wasn't just stating a fact, she was giving them a strategy. They could not give in to fear. Arthur looked at the girl, at the red ribbon in her hand, and the spark of defiance he had felt earlier roared into a flame. She was right. Fear was their primary weapon. But what if they could turn that weapon against them? "Marcus," Arthur said, his mind starting to work again, not like a CEO, but like a cornered strategist. "They think they've pushed us into this corner. They expect us to hide, to be paralyzed. But they made a mistake." Marcus looked at him, curious. "What?" "They underestimated us. They underestimated all of us." He knelt in front of Lara. "Lara, you said you heard that man, Petrov, mention another man's name when he was with him. Do you remember what it was?" The girl frowned, concentrating. Her memory was the only real weapon they had. He called him Cicero, she said finally. He said Cicero was the artist who set up the targets. The name Cicero lit a bulb in Marcus's mind. Cicero. There's a known forger and information broker in the underworld who uses that moniker, an elusive guy who sells detailed profiles of targets to major crime syndicates. No one's ever been able to prove a thing against him. Then that's him, Arthur said. He's the hunter. He studied my life, found my weaknesses. Davies was just the contact, the inside man. Petrov was the actor. But Cicero is the mastermind behind the hunt. Suddenly, the faceless enemy began to take shape. They were no longer fighting shadows. And if Cicero was the brains, he was also the link that could connect everything. The scrap Iron Joe con, Davies's betrayal, Petrov's charade. They had to find him. The idea was insane. 2 men and a child with no resources, hunting one of the most discreet operators in organized crime. But it was the only chance they had. They couldn't go to the police. The fabricated evidence against Arthur made that impossible. They had to find their own proof, create their own justice. The night wore on, and a plan began to form. A desperate, high-stakes plan that depended on Marcus's intelligence, Arthur's newfound courage, and most crucially, the sharp memory and perception of an 8-year-old girl. They would no longer run. They would turn the tables. The hunted would become the hunter. In the middle of the night, while Elena dozed fitfully on the sofa, Arthur saw Lara sitting at the small kitchen table, a pencil in hand, drawing under the dim light. He walked over. She wasn't drawing flowers or houses. With an unnerving accuracy, she was drawing a face she had seen only for a few seconds, through the crack of a door. The face of the man who was talking to Petrov, the face of Cicero. The plan was a madness born of desperation, an all-or-nothing gamble on a board where they controlled none of the pieces. Using Lara's drawing and Marcus's network of informants, they discovered one of Cicero's meeting spots, a complex of abandoned warehouses down by the river, a grey, forgotten part of the city. The bait would be Arthur. He would call Mr. Davies, his former lawyer and betrayer, pretending to be broken and terrified, willing to hand over the girl and her mother in exchange for his own safety and a small piece of the money. It was a lie that turned his stomach. But the only one Cicero, with his cynical and predatory worldview, would believe. The hope was that the mastermind of the operation himself would come to oversee the capture of his only eyewitness. At dawn, the cold, damp air from the river enveloped Arthur as he waited beside his car in the center of a cracked concrete courtyard. He had never felt so out of his element, his expensive suit a ridiculous costume in this landscape of rust and decay. Marcus was hidden in one of the warehouses with a long-range camera, while Elena and Lara were in a car several blocks away, waiting for the signal. A tiny earpiece was Arthur's only connection to safety. "He's coming!" Marcus's voice crackled in his ear. "Alone!" Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. The dark sedan, the same one from Elena's street, rolled into the courtyard and stopped at a calculated distance. The door opened and a man got out. It was him. The face from Lara's drawing, perfectly recreated by the girl's memory, now in the flesh. Elegant in a predatory way, Cicero approached, a contemptuous smile on his lips. "Arthur, I must admit, I'm surprised you had the nerve to seek me out," he said, his voice calm but vibrating with power. "Where are they?" "First, the deal," Arthur replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Guarantees that I walk away from this clean." Cicero laughed, a dry, joyless sound. "Did you really think you could turn this around, that you could negotiate? You have nothing, Arthur. Your company, your reputation, it's all gone. I built your ruin brick by brick. You are my trophy." He took another step, the predator closing in on his cornered prey. "Now tell me where the woman and child are, and maybe I'll ask my friends in prison not to be too rough on you." It was then that the sound of sirens cut through the air, growing rapidly louder. Cicero's smile widened. "Ah, and here comes your guarantee," he said, relishing the confusion and panic dawning on Arthur's face. "I called the police myself. A clandestine meeting between a fugitive fraudster and his accomplice. It fits the narrative I created for you rather nicely, don't you think? The trap wasn't for Lara and Elena. The trap was for him." Squad cars blocked the courtyard's exit, and armed officers swarmed out, surrounding the two men. A grim-faced detective approached. "Arthur Pierce, you're under arrest for fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice." Cicero raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Thank God, detective. This man lured me here, trying to blackmail me. Everything was lost. Their plan had been reversed on them with diabolical perfection. Marcus was trapped in his observation post, helpless. As the officers moved to cuff Arthur, the inconspicuous car carrying Elena and Lara drove slowly into the courtyard. Elena got out, her face pale with fear, but resolute. The detective turned, annoyed by the interruption. "Ma'am, step back. This is a crime scene." "He's lying," Elena said, her voice trembling as she pointed at Cicero. "That man threatened my daughter." The detective gave her a look of weary skepticism. "Ma'am, this is a serious investigation. We don't have time for fantasies." At that moment, Lara got out of the car. She walked with a calmness that none of the adults there possessed, stopping beside her mother. She looked directly at the detective, her eyes fearless. "It's not a fantasy," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the silent courtyard. She held up her hand, and in it was Marcus's cell phone, which he had given her in case of an emergency. "So you'll want to see the picture I took of his face." Lara's words hung in the tense air, carrying a weight that belied her age. The detective, whose skepticism was armor forged by years of false testimony and dead ends, looked at the girl, the irritation on his face giving way to a flicker of curiosity. Cicero let out a mocking laugh. "A picture? Detective, are we really going to entertain this? It's the desperate trick of a ruined man using a child." He gestured toward Arthur, painting him as a cruel puppet master, but the detective didn't take his eyes off Lara. There was something in her posture, a complete lack of artifice, that made him hesitate. "What picture? Little girl?" he asked, his tone a fraction softer. Lara didn't answer with words. With steady fingers, she unlocked the phone and opened the gallery. She held it out to the detective. The image on the screen was not of Cicero's face in the courtyard. It was a photo taken discreetly, through a gap, from a low angle. The quality was imperfect, grainy, but the image was undeniable. It showed Cicero and Petrov sitting together at a table at a lavish outdoor cafe, laughing, with documents spread between them. Documents that, when zoomed in, revealed the logo of Arthur's company. It was the proof they never had, the visual link between the mastermind and the actor. The photo that Lara, with a survivor's intuition, had snapped on the day she first observed them in the building, an instinct to record something that felt wrong, dangerous. Cicero's smile faltered. He took a step toward Lara, predatory instinct taking over. "That proves nothing. It's photoshopped." But Marcus, seeing his opening, had already emerged from his hiding place, hands raised, holding his own camera. "I have video of him admitting to everything, detective," he said, his voice projecting across the yard. "I've recorded every word since he stepped out of that car, including the part where he bragged about framing Mr. Pierce and calling the police himself." Cicero's trap, which had seemed so perfect, had become his own cage. The detective looked from the photo on the phone to the video camera in Marcus's hands, and then to Cicero's face, where the veneer of control was finally beginning to crack, revealing the panic underneath. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The anonymous tip, the targeted investigation, the dismissed testimony of a child. It all started to make sense in a new light. In the weeks that followed, Cicero's network crumbled like a house of cards. Lara's photo, combined with Marcus's recorded confession, was the thread that unraveled the entire tapestry. The investigation into Arthur was dropped and redirected toward the criminal organization. Mr. Davies, confronted with the exposed betrayal, confessed in exchange for a reduced sentence, detailing years of schemes and cons. Other victims, emboldened by the news, finally came forward, including a now courageous Scrap Iron Joe. The name Petrov was linked to a real identity, and an international arrest warrant was issued. Cicero, the untouchable artist, found himself entangled in a web of irrefutable evidence. The man who prided himself on never getting his hands dirty was now in handcuffs. For Arthur, the legal victory was almost an anticlimax. His company, though saved from bankruptcy, was scarred by the scandal. His name, cleared in the eyes of the law, still carried the wounds of public humiliation. But something fundamental had changed within him. The empire he had fought so hard to build no longer seemed like the ultimate prize. During the long hours of depositions and meetings with lawyers, he found himself thinking not of spreadsheets and profit projections, but of Elena and Lara. He had set them up in a safe apartment, far from everything, ensuring they had all they needed, but the distance felt wrong. Their absence in his life had created a void that no corporate victory could fill. One afternoon, after an exhausting meeting with his new board of directors, he dismissed his driver and drove himself to their temporary apartment. He knocked on the door, feeling a nervousness he hadn't felt in years. Eleanor opened it, and their eyes met in a charged silence. "I came to talk," he said, his voice oddly shy. She let him in. Lara was at the kitchen table doing her homework. She looked up at him and smiled, a genuine, warm smile that thawed something in Arthur's chest. He sat across from them, not as a millionaire, not as a boss, but as a man who finally understood what mattered. "I can't go back to the way things were," he began, looking at Elena. "None of it makes sense anymore. But I also can't imagine a future without you two in it. I know I have no right to ask, after everything I've put you through, but I'd like to propose something. Not a job, not charity, a partnership, a family." The word family hung in the small kitchen, as delicate and powerful as a butterfly. Elena looked at Arthur, her eyes searching his face for any sign of pity or obligation. What she found was something she had never seen there before: vulnerability. The mask of unshakable control was gone, replaced by a raw sincerity and an almost boyish hope. Lara, for her part, stopped writing and looked from her mother's face to Arthur's, her wise eyes absorbing the weight of the moment. She didn't smile, nor did she seem surprised. There was a quiet acceptance in her expression, as if she were simply watching a piece of fate she already knew was written. "I don't know what that means, Mr. Pierce," Eleanor said at last, her voice a whisper. "We come from different worlds." "We did," he corrected her gently. "Our worlds collided, Eleanor. And in that crash, I found out what actually has value. It's not the buildings, not the bank accounts. It's loyalty, it's courage, it's protecting the people who protect you. I spent my whole life building an empire of things, but I was bankrupt in the ways that truly matter. You two showed me that." He turned to Lara. "You saved me, Lara, not just my money or my freedom. You saved my soul from an arrogance that was blinding me. And I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you are safe, happy, and have every opportunity the world can offer. Not as a debt, but because I already love you like a daughter." The tears that welled in Elena's eyes this time were not of fear or despair, but of an emotion so overwhelming she couldn't name it. It was relief, gratitude, and the blooming of a feeling she had kept locked away in her heart out of fear. She glanced at her daughter, who gave a small, solemn nod, a silent blessing. In that moment, the barriers of class, of history, of pain dissolved. They were just three people who had weathered a storm together and emerged on the other side, irrevocably bound. 5 weeks after that intercepted call, Arthur Pierce's penthouse office was a transformed space. The heavy drapes had been replaced by light blinds that let sunlight flood the room, where a dark mahogany bar once stood. There was now a colorful bookshelf filled with children's and young adult novels, and on the imposing chairman's desk, next to the state-of-the-art computer, sat a dinosaur-shaped pencil holder and a framed drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a tall building. Arthur, who had legally adopted Lara, found that fatherhood suited him better than any designer suit. He restructured his company, but he did so with a new purpose. The Pierce Corporate Protection Foundation became the company's most important division, dedicated to educating small and medium-sized business owners about financial scams, using his own traumatic, now anonymized case as the primary study. Elena, who refused to stop working, became the foundation's administrator, her empathy and life experience an invaluable bridge to the people they helped. The final scene unfolds on a Friday afternoon. Arthur is sitting at his desk, but he isn't looking at stock market figures. He's helping Lara with a math problem, chuckling at his own difficulty in remembering the rules for long division. Elena comes in with a tray holding coffee for him and juice for Lara. The desk phone, the same device that had nearly broadcast his ruin, rings. Arthur answers it, his voice calm and confident. Pierce Foundation, how can I help? He listens to a business owner's story on the other end, a story frighteningly familiar with its promises too good to be true. Arthur listens patiently, and at the end, he says the words that have become his new motto. Don't worry, you're not alone. We're going to help you see what's hiding in the shadows. He hangs up the phone, and his gaze meets Lara's. She gives him a knowing smile, the smile of someone who understands the secret of the universe. Arthur realizes, with a clarity that fills him with peace, that true protection doesn't come from high walls or security guards, but from the unexpected. It had come in the form of an 8-year-old girl whose street smarts had outmatched decades of business experience, and whose brave heart had taught him how to tell the difference between the gleam of fool's gold and the priceless value of true family.